Welcome to channel. Don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon of June 29, 1995, in the upscale Sochogu district of Seoul, South Korea, was heavy with the humid, sticky heat of a looming monsoon season. Inside the Sampoong Department Store, the air conditioning was a frigid sanctuary for the thousands of shoppers wandering through corridors of Italian marble and glass. Women in high-end fashion browsed the cosmetics counters on the ground floor, where the air smelled of expensive lilies and French perfumes. On the fifth floor, families sat on traditional floor mats in the Sancheon restaurant, enjoying bowls of cold naengmyeon noodles to beat the heat. The building felt like a fortress of modern success, a shimmering pink marbled monument to the miracle on the Han River. At exactly 5:52 p.m., the music playing over the store speakers was silenced by a sound so violent it was mistaken for a North Korean air strike. It wasn't a rumble, it was a rhythmic series of explosions, the sound of steel rebar snapping like dry twigs and concrete slabs shattering like dinner plates. In the span of just 20 seconds, the entire south wing of the building, a massive 5-story structure, simply vanished. The fifth floor fell onto the fourth crushed the third obliterated the second. By the time the dust cloud, thick and grey like volcanic ash, rose over the Seoul skyline, the 5-story luxury mall had been reduced to a pile of jagged debris barely 2 stories high. 502 people were crushed to death in an instant or buried alive in the dark, suffocating cavities beneath the ruins. Nearly 1,000 more were injured, their lives changed forever by a building they thought was a symbol of safety. But as the rescue workers began to dig through the rubble with their bare hands, a terrifying truth began to emerge. This was not an act of God. It was not a terrorist attack. It was a catastrophe engineered by human hands, hidden behind a facade of prestige and luxury. Later in this video, we are going to dive into the most shocking revelation of the entire investigation: a single, arrogant decision regarding 3 massive air conditioning units that effectively turned the roof into a ticking time bomb. We will look at how the building's owner, Lee Jun, ignored the literal screams of the structure to keep the cash registers ringing for just a few more hours. You will learn about the 15-ton ghosts that were dragged across the roof, leaving invisible scars that would eventually rip the building apart. The Sampoong Department Store was more than just a place to shop. It was the crown jewel of South Korea's economic explosion. Opened in December 1989, it was the pinnacle of the Sampoong Group's ambitious portfolio. To understand the scale, you have to look at the numbers. The store covered a staggering 80,000 square feet of floor space. That is equivalent to roughly 1.5 American football fields stacked on top of each other, 5 times over. It was a labyrinth of luxury, housing everything from a high-end supermarket in the basement to an art gallery and a plethora of restaurants on the top floor. Every single day, an average of 40,000 people passed through its doors. That is the entire capacity of Fenway Park in Boston, or the total population of the city of Monaco, filtered through a single building every 24 hours. The construction cost was roughly $120 million in 1989. In today's money, that is nearly $300 million, a budget that could easily build a state-of-the-art skyscraper or a massive bridge. The exterior was clad in distinctive pink Italian marble, shimmering under the Seoul sun, earned it the nickname the Pink Palace. The building was a flat slab design, a sophisticated engineering choice that eliminated horizontal beams. Instead, the weight of the floors was carried directly by 450 massive reinforced concrete columns. It is a design that creates beautiful, open, airy spaces, perfect for a luxury mall. These columns were the legs of the giant, and each one was supposed to be 90 centimeters in diameter. To visualize that, imagine a column the width of a standard residential doorway, solid concrete, packed with 16 thick steel reinforcing bars. The building had passed every single safety inspection. It had been certified by the city government. It was the busiest, most profitable department store in the country. It was a place where people felt safe, where the elite came to be seen and the middle class came to celebrate. It was legal, it was modern, and it was supposedly indestructible. There was no reason to doubt the ground beneath your feet. Yet, as we will see, every single one of those columns was a lie. The strength of the concrete was below standard, the steel was missing in critical areas, and the very foundation of the building's design had been compromised before the first shopper ever walked through the door. The collapse of the Sampoong Department Store remains the deadliest non-terrorist structural collapse in modern history. We often assume that big buildings are permanent landmarks, as solid as the ground they stand on. We trust the engineers, the inspectors, and the signatures on the blueprints. But the Sampoong Department Store proves that even the most glittering palace can be a house of cards if human greed outweighs structural integrity. This was a building that was literally held together by hope and corruption until the laws of physics finally demanded payment. Stay with us as we peel back the layers of pink marble to reveal the rot underneath and explain the physics of how a building that was supposed to last centuries fell apart in less time than it takes to breathe. To understand why the Sampoong Department Store fell, we have to look past the pink marble and into the dark heart of corporate greed and engineering malpractice. The story of the collapse doesn't begin in 1995, but in 1987, when the blueprints were first drawn. Originally, the site was never meant to be a mall. It was designed as a 4-story residential office building. However, midway through construction, the chairman of the Sampoong Group, Lee Jun, demanded a total redesign. He wanted a department store. When the original contractors, Woo-Sung Construction, refused to make the changes, warning that the foundation and columns couldn't support the extra weight and the removal of support walls, Lee Jun didn't listen. He simply fired them and hired his own company's construction division to finish the job his way. This was the first domino to fall. In a flat slab construction, the relationship between the floor and the column is everything. Think of it like a heavy book resting on the tip of a pencil. If the book is too heavy or the pencil is too thin, the pencil will poke right through the paper. In engineering, we call this punching shear. To prevent this, engineers usually place a wide drop panel or a column capital at the top of each pillar to spread the weight. But Lee Jun wanted more space for escalators and aesthetics. He ordered the columns to be slimmed down from the safety standard 90 centimeters to just 60 centimeters. To put that in perspective, he took a support as wide as a large tractor tire and reduced it to the width of a standard car tire, while actually increasing the weight it had to carry. But the structural integrity was compromised even further. In the original blueprints, each of these critical columns was supposed to be packed with 16 thick longitudinal steel reinforcement bars to provide the necessary yield strength. During the investigation, it was discovered that many of these columns contained only 8 bars. This halved the internal skeleton of the building. Furthermore, the L-shaped reinforcement bars that connect the floor slab to the column were placed too low, nearly 10 centimeters below where they should have been. This meant the connection between the floors and the columns was practically non-existent. The building wasn't a single cohesive unit, it was a stack of heavy plates barely balanced on thin, brittle sticks. Then came the fatal addition, the 5th floor. Originally, the building was supposed to have only 4 levels. Lee Jun decided to add a 5th, intended for a roller rink. However, local zoning laws at the time prohibited a roller rink, so he pivoted and decided to install 8 traditional Korean restaurants instead. This decision was a death sentence for the building. Traditional Korean dining involves ondol, a floor heating system where hot water pipes are buried in a thick layer of concrete. This added a massive, unintended dead load to the structure. Instead of a light wooden floor for skating, the 5th floor was now topped with a massive, 4-foot-thick slab of concrete and piping. The weight increased by thousands of tons, far exceeding the original load capacity the foundation was designed to handle. The final catalyst, the smoking gun of the catastrophe, was located on the roof. The building used 3 massive industrial air conditioning units. Combined, these units weighed 36 tons, roughly the weight of 7 adult African elephants standing on a single corner of the roof. When neighbors complained about the noise of these units, the management decided to move them to the other side of the building. To save the cost of a specialized crane, which would have cost roughly $15,000, they did the unthinkable. They put the 36-ton units on rollers and dragged them across the roof surface while the units were still full of water. This act of staggering negligence sent rhythmic shockwaves through the building, a phenomenon known as dynamic loading. As these massive metal boxes were dragged, they created microcracks in the already strained fifth-floor columns. Each inch they moved, the punching shear stress increased. The roof slab began to groan. It was like a piece of glass that had been scored by a diamond. It looked solid, but the structural bond was shattered. By the morning of June 29th, the point of no return had been reached. Cracks in the fifth floor were now large enough to fit a human hand inside. The ceiling of the fifth floor restaurants began to sag visibly. Staff reported hearing loud pops and metallic snaps, the sound of steel rebars reaching their yield strength and snapping under the impossible tension. Management responded by simply closing the fifth-floor restaurants and moving the luxury goods to the basement. They turned off the air conditioning because the vibrations were causing chunks of concrete to fall from the ceiling. Even as the building screamed in agony, Lee Jun refused to evacuate, fearing the loss of a single day's revenue. He chose to gamble with the lives of 40,000 people to protect his profit margin, ignoring the fact that the laws of physics do not care about a balance sheet. By 5 p.m. on that fateful Thursday, the fate of the Sampoong Department Store was already sealed. The fifth floor had begun to fail in a way that was visible to the naked eye. It wasn't just a subtle shift, the floor had dropped by nearly 10 centimeters, the height of a standard smartphone, leaving a yawning gap between the ceiling and the support columns. In the Sunshine restaurant, the kitchen floor was slanted so severely that heavy soup pots were sliding off the stoves. At 5:40 p.m., a sharp, metallic crack echoed through the atrium, louder than a gunshot. This was the sound of the steel rebar in the roof finally snapping under the 36-ton weight of the air conditioning units. Still, no alarm was raised, no evacuation was ordered. The management feared that an evacuation would lead to a stampede, or worse, a loss in sales during the peak evening rush. At 5:50 p.m., just 2 minutes before the end, the staff on the fifth floor finally realized the building was dying. They screamed for shoppers to get out, but their voices were drowned out by the ambient noise of a busy mall. At 5:52 p.m., the columns on the fifth floor gave way entirely. Because of the flat slab design we discussed, there were no horizontal beams to arrest the fall. The roof slab slammed into the fifth floor. This combined mass, now thousands of tons of concrete moving at the speed of gravity, hit the fourth floor. It was a pancake collapse, a chain reaction of destruction where each floor acted as a massive hammer, smashing the one below it. From the moment the roof began to move to the moment the basement was pulverized, only 20 seconds elapsed. That is less time than it takes to tie your shoelaces. The aftermath was a scene from a nightmare. A giant, jagged crater had replaced the south wing of the shimmering pink palace. A plume of dust rose hundreds of feet into the air, visible from across the city, looking like a bomb had detonated in the heart of Seoul. For those inside, the world simply turned black. Survivors described a sensory overload, the sudden choking smell of ruptured gas lines, the hiss of broken water pipes, and a silence so profound it was terrifying, broken only by the muffled, rhythmic screams of those buried deep within the tomb of concrete. Local residents, taxi drivers and shopkeepers didn't wait for the authorities. They rushed toward the ruins, digging with their bare hands and using car jacks to lift massive slabs of marble. The human toll was staggering. 502 people were confirmed dead. To visualize this loss, imagine an entire Boeing 747 jumbo jet filled to capacity, with every single passenger and crew member vanishing in an instant. But amidst the tragedy, there were miracles that captured the world's attention. Choi Myung-seok was pulled from the rubble after 11 days. He survived by drinking rainwater that seeped through the cracks and eating pieces of cardboard to stave off hunger. Yoo Ji-hwan was rescued after 13 days, having spent over 300 hours in total darkness. And most incredibly, 19-year-old Park Sung-hyun was found alive after 17 days, 400 hours, buried in a space no larger than a kitchen cabinet, without a single drop of water for the final few days of her ordeal. As the dust settled, the grief of the nation turned into a scorching, righteous rage. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that was even more structural than the concrete. It wasn't just bad engineering, it was a systemic failure of ethics. Investigators found that the Sampoong group had paid massive bribes, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars, to local government officials to approve the illegal design changes and overlook the blatant safety violations. Lee Jun, the chairman, was arrested. His reaction during his first public appearance was cold and haunting. Instead of apologizing for the 500 lives lost, he complained to reporters that he was the victim because his property had been destroyed. He famously stated, "My property is gone, my building is gone, the lives of the shoppers, they are gone too, but my wealth was built over decades." The legal battle that followed was a turning point for South Korean society. Lee Jun was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison, a sentence that was later reduced to 7.5 years, a number many felt was an insult to the families of the victims. His son, Lee Han-sang, the store's president, received 7 years. Dozens of city officials were jailed for accepting bribes, including 2 former administrators of the Socho district. The investigation proved that at least 25% of the buildings constructed in Seoul during the rapid expansion of the 1980s were unsafe and required major reconstruction. The Sampoong collapse wasn't an isolated incident, it was a symptom of a country that had grown too fast, cutting every possible corner to keep up with the miracle on the Han River. Data logs from the building management systems later showed that the vibrations from the air conditioning units had been creating a pendulum effect for years. Every time the fans kicked on, the building swayed by tiny fractions of a millimeter, slowly grinding the concrete around the missing steel rebar into useless dust. By the time the investigation team looked at the remaining columns in the north wing, they found that the concrete was so weak it could be crumbled by hand. It was tofu construction, a term that would become a dark part of the national vocabulary. The technical failure was punching shear, but the moral failure was the belief that profit could ever override the laws of physics. The dust from the Sampoong Department Store collapse didn't just settle on the streets of Seoul, it settled on the very soul of a nation. This wasn't just a building failure, it was the end of an era of blind, reckless ambition. In the weeks following the tragedy, the South Korean government launched the most comprehensive structural audit in the history of modern engineering. They inspected every single high-rise building, bridge and tunnel constructed during the miracle on the Han River. The results were terrifying. Out of nearly 300 high-rise buildings inspected, only 2%, just 6 buildings, were found to be completely safe and built to code. Roughly 80% required massive, expensive structural repairs, and 1 in 7 was so dangerously unstable that it had to be demolished immediately. Imagine walking through a city where 98% of the skyscrapers you see are potentially lethal. That was the reality for Seoul in 1995. The tragedy forced the immediate passage of the Special Act on Safety Control for public structures. This law revolutionized the industry, creating a mandatory centralized inspection system and imposing massive criminal penalties for engineers and contractors who cut corners. It ended the era of self-regulation, where developers like Lee Jun could effectively act as their own inspectors. The Sampoong disaster proved that when the private sector is allowed to police its own greed, the price is paid in human lives. But the most haunting question remains: why wasn't this prevented? Just 8 months before Sampoong fell, the Songsu Bridge in Seoul had collapsed during the morning rush hour, killing 32 people because of poor welding and rusted steel. The warnings were everywhere. The culture of bali bali, the Korean phrase for hurry hurry, had prioritized speed and profit over the very laws of physics. For decades, the country had been sprinting toward economic dominance, but the Sampoong collapse was the moment the legs of the runner simply gave out. It was a mirror of systemic decisions where the safety factor, usually a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 margin of error in engineering, had been whittled down to 0 in the name of a higher dividend. Today, the site where the Pink Palace once stood is occupied by a luxury apartment complex called Daesang Kanaville. There is no grand plaque on the spot. The physical memory of the 502 victims has been largely built over by the relentless expansion of the city. To find the memorial, you have to travel to Yangjae Citizens Forest, a quiet park miles away from the site of the blood and concrete. This separation is symbolic of how society often wants to move on from tragedy without truly confronting the causes. The victims weren't killed by a freak accident, they were killed by a series of deliberate, calculated choices made in air-conditioned boardrooms. Every time you walk into a mall, cross a bridge or step into an elevator, you are making a silent pact of trust with people you will never meet. You trust that the person who poured the concrete didn't sell the steel on the black market. You trust that the inspector wasn't looking for a bribe. You trust that the owner values your life more than a 15% increase in floor space. The Sampoong Department Store is a permanent, grim reminder that this trust is fragile. It is a story of how 20 seconds of gravity can undo 20 years of corruption, and why the most important part of any building isn't the marble on the outside, but the integrity of the people who built it. What do you think is the biggest threat to modern engineering today? Is it the complexity of our new mega projects, or is it still the same old story of human greed and corporate shortcuts? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the Sampoong catastrophe insightful, hit the like button and share this video. It helps us keep telling these forgotten stories of human ambition and failure. Don't forget to subscribe for more engineering breakdowns and historical mysteries. Thank you for watching and stay safe.